In the heart of Chicago during the blazing, restless years of the Roaring Twenties, the nights felt louder than the days, and the city pulsed with a kind of electricity that made ordinary people believe they were living inside a movie. Jazz spilled out of hidden clubs, laughter echoed through smoke-filled rooms, and behind unmarked doors, illegal liquor flowed as freely as secrets. It was a time when rules were meant to be bent, when reputations were built overnight, and when one reckless decision could turn a private life into a public spectacle. In a modest apartment on the south side of the city lived a woman who, at first glance, seemed like just another young wife trying to find her place in a fast-moving world. But her name, Beulah Annan, would soon become one of the most whispered and debated in America. Beulah was not born into fame or fortune, yet she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she deserved more than an ordinary life. She had striking blonde hair, expressive eyes, and a carefully practiced smile that could appear sweet, wounded, or mysterious, depending on what the moment required. She loved music, especially the lively piano tunes that defined the era, and she loved attention even more. Her marriage, however, was far less glamorous than the world outside her window. Her husband worked long hours, often away from home, and while he provided stability, he did not provide excitement. And in 1920 Chicago, excitement was everywhere. It shimmered in neon lights, it echoed in the rhythm of jazz bands, and it lingered in the glances exchanged between strangers across crowded rooms. It was in this atmosphere that Beulah met Harry Kalstedt, a man who represented everything her quiet domestic life did not. He was charming in a casual way, the kind of man who knew how to lean in just close enough to make a woman feel chosen. What began as harmless conversation slowly transformed into something deeper and more dangerous. Their meetings became more frequent, their laughter more intimate, and soon secrecy became part of the thrill. For Beulah, this was not simply an affair, it was an escape, a doorway into the dazzling world she believed she belonged in. She imagined herself as the heroine of her own jazz-age drama, living boldly while others played it safe. But affairs built on fantasy rarely survive contact with reality. Behind the flirtation and the whispered promises, tension was growing. Harry was not the perfect romantic figure Beulah may have imagined. There were rumors of other women, hints of betrayal, small cracks forming in the illusion. And in a decade defined by passion and impulsiveness, emotions could ignite faster than reason could extinguish them. On April 3, 1924, inside Beulah's apartment, those emotions finally exploded. The evening did not begin as a headline. It began like many others, a private meeting, closed curtains, a conversation that may have started calmly but quickly spiraled into confrontation. Words were exchanged, accusations hurled, voices raised. We can only imagine the intensity in that small room, the air heavy with anger and disappointment. According to later accounts, Beulah claimed she discovered that Harry had been unfaithful, that he had lied to her, that he had made her feel foolish for believing in him. Whether it was jealousy, humiliation, fear, or a combination of all three, something snapped. In a matter of seconds, emotion overtook restraint. A gun was drawn. Then came the sound that would shatter not just the silence of the apartment, but the illusion of control Beulah thought she had over her life. One shot rang out, and then another, and another. 5 bullets in total tore through the room. When the echoes faded, Harry Kalstedt lay on the floor, mortally wounded. The chaos of the argument was replaced by a chilling stillness. What happened next would become one of the most haunting images of the entire case. Instead of fleeing, instead of collapsing in hysteria, Beulah reportedly sat down at the piano. As neighbors later described, music drifted through the walls shortly after the gunshots. Imagine that for a moment. In an apartment where a man lay dying, the soft notes of a tune floated into the hallway. Was it shock? Was it denial? Or was it an attempt to steady trembling hands and racing thoughts? When the police arrived, they did not find a screaming suspect or a frantic woman covered in tears. They found Beulah calm, composed, almost detached. She admitted to the shooting. She reportedly said she had killed him because he had the nerve to tell her he was leaving her. In that instant, the story transformed from a private tragedy into a public sensation. A beautiful young woman, an illicit affair, a jealous confrontation, and a dead lover. Chicago's newspapers could not have invented a more compelling narrative. The city that thrived on spectacle had just been handed its next obsession. Yet before the trial, before the headlines grew larger and the crowds gathered outside the courthouse, there was this moment, this apartment, this choice, this irreversible act that changed everything. To understand that moment, you have to understand the pressure of the era. The 1920s celebrated freedom, especially for women who were stepping outside traditional roles, cutting their hair short, dancing in clubs, and claiming independence. But that freedom was fragile. Society was fascinated by bold women, yet quick to judge them. Beulah stood at the intersection of admiration and condemnation. She had dared to pursue passion, to live beyond the boundaries of her marriage, and now she had crossed an even darker line. As the night of the shooting faded into early morning, sirens echoed through the streets of Chicago, and word began to spread. A woman had killed her lover. Not in self-defense, at least not in the version first told, but out of anger, out of betrayal, out of emotion. In a city already intoxicated by drama, this story felt almost cinematic. And at the center of it all was Beulah Annan, no longer just a wife in a small apartment, but a figure who would soon captivate an entire nation. When the shock of that night began to settle and the flashing police lights faded from the walls of her apartment, the story of Beulah Annan did not quiet down. It grew louder, more complicated, and far more strategic. At first, everything seemed straightforward. She had admitted to shooting Harry Kalstead. The police had her statement. The weapon had been recovered. A man was dead, and the woman who pulled the trigger had not denied it. In most cases, that would have been the end of the mystery and the beginning of an inevitable conviction. But this was 1924, and this was Chicago, a city where truth was often shaped as much by headlines as by evidence. In those early hours after her arrest, Beulah reportedly told authorities that she shot Harry because he had told her he was leaving. There was anger in that confession, a sense of wounded pride. It painted a picture of jealousy and emotional fury. 5 shots were fired, not one, and that detail alone gave prosecutors confidence. They believed they had a clear case of deliberate murder driven by passion. The narrative was simple. A woman scorned, enraged by rejection, pulled the trigger again and again. But as the days passed and Beulah sat in custody, something shifted. The initial confession began to soften, then to transform. The sharp edges of jealousy were gradually replaced by the language of fear. Now the story suggested that Harry had not been calmly announcing his departure, but had become aggressive. Now there were hints that he had threatened her, that she had felt trapped, that the gun was fired not in rage, but in self-defense. The change was subtle at first, then more deliberate. The woman who had seemed almost brazen in her admission was now emerging as someone frightened, overwhelmed, and forced into a desperate act. This evolution of her story did not happen in isolation. It unfolded under the relentless gaze of the press. Newspapers across the city, especially the powerful Chicago Tribune, seized on every detail. Reporters described her appearance, her clothing, her expressions in court. They analyzed her smile, speculated about her marriage, and reconstructed the apartment scene as though it were a stage set. Headlines were dramatic, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes scandalized. She was described as beautiful, as cold, as tragic, as manipulative, often all in the same week. The public devoured it. In the Roaring '20s, crime was not just a matter for the courts, it was entertainment. Readers followed the case like a serialized drama, waiting for the next twist. And Beulah, whether intentionally or instinctively, seemed to understand that she was no longer just defending herself in a courtroom. She was performing before an audience. Her legal team began to craft a more cohesive narrative. Instead of focusing on the betrayal, they emphasized vulnerability. They portrayed her as a young woman caught in a dangerous situation, a man looming over her, a struggle escalating out of control. The 5 shots, which initially seemed excessive, were reframed as panic. When a person is terrified, they argued, they do not count bullets. They do not measure restraint. They react. At the same time, Beulah's demeanor became part of the defense. She appeared in court well-dressed, composed, sometimes even fragile. Observers noted how she dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, how her voice trembled when she spoke. To some, it looked rehearsed. To others, it looked heartbreakingly sincere. But what mattered most was how it landed with the public and eventually with the all-male jury who would decide her fate. The prosecution faced an unexpected challenge. They had the facts of the shooting, but facts alone were competing against emotion, spectacle, and a shifting storyline. They reminded the court that she had not immediately claimed self-defense. They highlighted the number of shots fired. They questioned why she had reportedly played the piano after the shooting, suggesting that such behavior did not align with someone who had just survived an attack. Was that the action of a terrified victim or of someone disturbingly calm? Yet even that detail became part of the defense's counterargument. Shock, they insisted, affects people in unpredictable ways. Trauma can create detachment. Music might have been her way of coping, of grounding herself in a moment too overwhelming to process. In a trial increasingly shaped by perception, every strange detail could be interpreted in more than one way. Meanwhile, the public's fascination intensified. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, hoping to catch a glimpse of her as she entered or left. Some women reportedly expressed sympathy, whispering that they understood what it meant to feel cornered or betrayed. Others condemned her, seeing in her actions a dangerous defiance of social norms. She became a symbol onto which people projected their own beliefs about love, loyalty, and female independence. Behind the scenes, strategy was everything. Her attorneys understood the cultural climate of the 1920s. Women were gaining visibility and independence, but traditional ideas about femininity still held powerful sway. A narrative of a cold-blooded killer might doom her. A narrative of a frightened woman defending her honor could save her. The difference between those two images lay not just in evidence, but in storytelling. And so the story continued to evolve, polished and refined with each court appearance. The confession that once sounded like a jealous outburst now seemed incomplete, perhaps misunderstood. The shooting that appeared intentional now carried the shadow of threat. Each retelling moved her slightly further from the image of a vengeful lover and closer to that of a woman who had no other choice. By the time the trial formally approached, the case was no longer simply about what happened in that apartment. It had become a battle over interpretation. Was Beulah Annan a calculating murderer who realized too late that her temper had destroyed everything? Or was she a woman who, in a moment of terror, did what she believed she had to do to survive? The city was divided, the newspapers relentless, and the courtroom poised to become the stage where this carefully reconstructed narrative would either collapse or triumph. By the time the trial of Beulah Annan officially began, the courtroom in Chicago no longer felt like a place reserved for quiet legal procedure. It felt like a theater, and everyone inside understood that they were about to witness a performance that could alter a woman's destiny. The benches filled early each morning, spectators leaning forward with anticipation, reporters clutching notepads, artists sketching her profile as though she were a stage actress rather than a defendant accused of murder. Outside, crowds gathered for a glimpse of her arrival, whispering her name as if she were already part of urban legend. When Beulah entered the courtroom, she did not shuffle in defeated or disheveled. She appeared composed, carefully dressed, every detail of her appearance seemingly intentional. Her clothes were modest but flattering, her hair neatly styled, her expression controlled. She knew eyes were on her, not just the judges or the lawyers, but the public's. The prosecution may have been preparing arguments rooted in law, but Beulah's defense understood something equally powerful: perception. The charges against her were serious. She had shot Harry Kalstedt 5 times. The prosecution wasted no time emphasizing that number. 5 shots suggested persistence, not panic. It suggested anger, not accident. They painted a stark picture for the jury, a woman furious at being rejected, pulling the trigger again and again until her lover collapsed. They reminded the courtroom that her initial confession did not mention fear or self-defense. In those early statements, there was no trembling victim. There was a woman who admitted she shot a man because he had the audacity to leave her. The prosecutor's voice carried across the room as he reconstructed the scene. He described the apartment, the argument, the gun raised at close range. He urged the jury to focus on facts rather than sympathy. A man was dead. The defendant had admitted to firing the weapon. Justice, he argued, demanded accountability. But when the defense rose to speak, the atmosphere shifted. Their strategy was not to deny the shooting. That would have been impossible. Instead, they reframed it. They spoke slowly, deliberately, appealing not just to logic, but to emotion. They described Beulah as a young woman cornered in her own home. They suggested that Harry had become threatening, that his anger escalated beyond words. In their telling, the gun was not drawn out of jealousy, but out of fear. The 5 shots were not evidence of cruelty, but of terror. When a person believes their life is in danger, they do not fire once and calmly reassess. They react until the threat is gone. The jury, 12 men, watched closely. In 1924, women did not serve on juries in Illinois. That fact alone shaped the dynamic of the trial. The defense understood the cultural expectations of the time. Women were often seen as fragile, emotional, in need of protection. If Beulah could be seen as a frightened woman rather than a calculating killer, she might stand a chance. As witnesses took the stand, each detail of that night was dissected. Neighbors testified about hearing gunshots, about the strange calm that followed. One of the most haunting elements resurfaced again and again: the piano. After the shooting, Beulah had reportedly sat down and played. The prosecution presented this as chilling behavior. What kind of person plays music while a man lies dying nearby? They implied it revealed coldness, even a lack of remorse. The defense countered with a different interpretation. Shock, they argued, manifests in unpredictable ways. Trauma can create a sense of detachment, as though the mind is protecting itself from unbearable reality. The piano might have been her refuge, the one familiar thing in a moment spiraling out of control. In a trial shaped by narrative, even the sound of music became open to interpretation. When Beulah herself took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Her voice was described as soft, sometimes trembling. She recounted the argument, her growing fear, the moment she believed Harry might harm her. She spoke of confusion, of panic, of a blur in which she barely remembered pulling the trigger multiple times. Tears reportedly filled her eyes. Whether those tears were genuine grief, fear of imprisonment, or calculated display was impossible to know with certainty. But they mattered. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing not just her words, but her expressions. The next morning's newspapers would describe the tilt of her head, the way she clutched a handkerchief, the pause before answering certain questions. The trial was unfolding not only in the courtroom, but across the city's front pages. The prosecution attempted to break through the emotional shield. They pressed her about inconsistencies in her story. Why had her initial confession sounded so different? Why had she not immediately claimed self-defense? Why 5 shots? Each question was designed to chip away at the image of vulnerability. At moments, the tension was palpable, but Beulah remained composed enough to avoid outright contradiction. She insisted that fear had overwhelmed her, that her earlier statements were made in shock, without legal guidance. As days turned into weeks, the courtroom drama intensified. Spectators began choosing sides. Some saw her as a manipulator who understood exactly how to present herself to an all-male jury. Others believed she embodied the tragic consequences of a volatile relationship in a fast-moving era. The case seemed to reflect larger anxieties about modern womanhood, independence, and morality in the 1920s. Closing arguments became the emotional climax of the trial. The prosecution urged the jury not to be distracted by appearance or performance. They reminded them that beneath the polished exterior was a woman who had fired a deadly weapon multiple times. Justice, they insisted, required a guilty verdict. The defense responded with a powerful appeal to empathy. They asked the jurors to imagine their own daughters or sisters in a threatening situation. They painted Beulah not as a villain, but as a human being pushed to the edge. In their final words, they emphasized doubt. And in criminal law, doubt can be enough. When the jury finally withdrew to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with anxious speculation. Hours passed. Outside, the public waited for word. Inside, Beulah sat quietly, her fate resting in the hands of 12 men who had spent weeks watching her, listening to her, and interpreting not just the evidence, but her very demeanor. The verdict, when it came, would not just decide her freedom. It would cement the trial's place in Chicago's history as one of the most dramatic courtroom spectacles of the era, a moment when justice, performance, media, and emotion collided under one roof, leaving the city to question whether it had witnessed a fair judgment or the triumph of a carefully crafted image. When the verdict was finally spoken, and Beulah Annan walked out of the courtroom a free woman, something unusual happened. Her story did not fade away like most criminal cases. Instead, it grew even larger. In many ways, the trial had only been the beginning. The city of Chicago had watched her transformation from an ordinary housewife into the center of a national spectacle, and now people were left with a lingering fascination. She had stood accused of killing a man, admitted to pulling the trigger, and yet convinced a jury that she did not deserve punishment. For some, it was justice. For others, it was something far more unsettling. In the weeks following her acquittal, newspapers continued to cover her every move. Reporters wanted to know what she would do next, how she would live, whether she felt relief, guilt, or triumph. Photographs captured her leaving buildings, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes appearing distant and thoughtful. The public, which had followed her trial with obsessive interest, was not ready to let her disappear back into anonymity. She had become more than a person. She had become a symbol of the era. Part of the fascination came from what she represented. The 1920s were a time of change, especially for women. They were gaining new freedoms, new visibility, and new independence. They were entering workplaces, social spaces, and cultural roles that had once been closed to them. But that freedom also came with scrutiny. Society watched closely, ready to celebrate or condemn. Beulah's case seemed to embody both possibilities at once. She was seen by some as a victim of emotional turmoil, and by others as someone who had manipulated the system to her advantage. Behind the public curiosity, Beulah herself appeared to retreat from the spotlight. She did not embrace fame in the way modern figures might. She did not tour the country giving interviews or seek celebrity status. Instead, she attempted to rebuild a life away from constant attention. She remarried, stepping back into the role of a wife, and for a time, it seemed she might succeed in escaping the shadow of her past. Yet even as she moved forward, the story of what happened in that apartment remained frozen in public memory. What made her case particularly enduring was how perfectly it captured the relationship between crime and media in the modern age. Her trial had not simply been a legal proceeding. It had been a public narrative shaped by headlines, emotion, and perception. Journalists had turned her into a character, crafting an image that audiences could interpret in different ways. Some portrayed her as fragile and sympathetic, while others hinted at calculation beneath her calm exterior. That duality kept people talking. Years later, her story would find a new life in art. A young reporter named Maureen Dallas Watkins had covered the trial firsthand. She had sat in the courtroom, observed the performances of both lawyers and defendant, and witnessed how public opinion could influence the atmosphere of justice. Inspired by what she saw, Watkins began to write. She transformed elements of Beulah's story into a fictional narrative, exploring themes of fame, manipulation, and media obsession. That narrative eventually became the stage musical Chicago, a production that would achieve enormous success. In the musical, the character of Roxy Hart, a woman who kills her lover and uses media attention to her advantage, echoed the real-life events that had unfolded decades earlier. Though the story was fictionalized, its emotional truth reflected the strange reality of Beulah's case, a world where the line between justice and performance could blur. The musical would later inspire the acclaimed film adaptation Chicago, bringing the story's themes to a new generation. Audiences around the world watched a dramatized version of events that had once unfolded in a real courtroom. The idea that someone could transform a murder trial into a kind of public spectacle resonated deeply. It raised uncomfortable questions about how society responds to crime, about how appearance and narrative can influence judgment. Meanwhile, the real Beulah continued living quietly. Unlike her fictional counterpart, she did not remain in the public eye. She avoided interviews and public commentary, allowing her story to exist without her direct participation. It was as though she understood that her survival depended on distance from the spotlight that had once defined her existence. Yet, no matter how quietly she lived, she could never completely escape the legacy of what had happened. For those who followed her case, she became a reminder of how unpredictable justice could be. Some believed she had genuinely acted in fear that the jury had correctly understood her situation. Others remained convinced that her acquittal revealed flaws in a system vulnerable to charm, appearance, and emotional storytelling. There was no single interpretation that satisfied everyone. What made her story endure was not just the crime itself, but what followed. Her transformation from accused murderer to cultural inspiration demonstrated the power of narrative. It showed how a single event, shaped by media and memory, could transcend its original moment. The courtroom where she once stood had long since emptied. The voices of lawyers and witnesses faded into history, but the story continued to echo in newspapers, books, and performances. Beulah Annan's life after the trial became quieter, but her impact grew louder. She had become part of a larger conversation about crime, gender, and public perception. Her name, once spoken in whispers of scandal, evolved into something almost mythic, a reminder of a time when the boundaries between reality and performance were not always clear, and when one woman's story revealed just how powerful perception could be. When the jury returned and the words "not guilty" echoed through the courtroom, it was as if time itself paused for a brief, disbelieving moment. Beulah Annan sat motionless, her face calm, almost unreadable, while the weight of what had just happened slowly settled over everyone in the room. Only weeks earlier, she had been a woman accused of killing her lover with 5 gunshots. Now she was a free woman. The tension that had filled the courtroom dissolved into murmurs, whispers, and the scratching of reporters' pens racing to capture the moment. Outside, the streets of Chicago buzzed with anticipation, waiting for confirmation of what many could hardly believe. For Beulah, the verdict did not erase what had happened in her apartment that night, but it changed her future in an instant. She had walked into the courtroom facing the possibility of prison, perhaps even spending the rest of her life behind iron bars. Instead, she walked out into the open air, into sunlight, into freedom. Yet freedom did not feel simple. It came with the weight of public attention, with thousands of strangers holding opinions about her guilt, her innocence, and her character. Some saw her as a survivor. Others saw her as a woman who had escaped justice. As she stepped outside, flashes from cameras captured her image. Her expression remained controlled, but beneath that calm surface must have been a storm of emotions, relief, exhaustion, uncertainty. She had spent months living under accusation, her every word and gesture examined. Now suddenly, that formal judgment was over. But the informal judgment of society would continue. Newspapers exploded with headlines. Some portrayed her acquittal as a triumph of justice, emphasizing her vulnerability, her emotional testimony, and the possibility that she had acted in fear. Others were more skeptical, questioning how someone who admitted to shooting a man multiple times could walk free. Editorials debated whether the jury had been influenced not just by facts, but by her appearance, her demeanor, and the emotional narrative presented by her defense. The public reaction was deeply divided. In cafes, in offices, in homes across Chicago, people argued about the case. Some women expressed sympathy, seeing in her story the emotional vulnerability and societal pressures they themselves understood. They saw a woman who had been pushed to the edge. But others, both men and women, viewed the outcome with unease. They wondered whether charm and performance had overshadowed truth. They questioned whether justice had been shaped by emotion rather than evidence. For Beulah herself, the days after the trial were strangely quiet. The constant presence of lawyers, guards, and courtroom officials disappeared. The rigid structure of legal proceedings gave way to open, unstructured time. Yet freedom came with a new challenge: how to live after becoming the center of such a massive public spectacle. She could not simply return to being anonymous. Her name had been printed in headlines, spoken in conversations, remembered by strangers. She returned to ordinary surroundings, but nothing felt entirely ordinary anymore. Familiar streets carried the weight of memory. Familiar rooms reminded her of how quickly life could change. Every sound, every quiet moment carried echoes of the past. The apartment where the shooting had occurred was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of a moment that had redefined her existence. Her legal victory had not erased the emotional consequences. Even though she had avoided prison, she had not escaped the reality that a man had died. Whether she saw herself as justified, as tragic, or as misunderstood, she carried the knowledge of that night with her. The courtroom had delivered its verdict, but memory does not follow legal rulings. Memory remains, replaying moments without resolution. Meanwhile, the case itself had already begun to transform into something larger than the individuals involved. It became part of Chicago's identity during the Roaring '20s, a decade defined by spectacle, change, and emotional intensity. The city had witnessed crimes before, but few had captured the public imagination in quite the same way. Beulah's trial had become a story people told and retold, each version shaped by personal interpretation. For Beulah, survival now meant distance. She gradually withdrew from the public spotlight. She avoided interviews, avoided public commentary, avoided opportunities to relive the experience. This was not the behavior of someone seeking fame. It was the behavior of someone trying to move forward, trying to rebuild an identity separate from the crime that had defined her in the public eye. But moving forward did not mean forgetting the emotional journey she had endured, the affair, the confrontation, the shooting, the arrest, the trial. The verdict had reshaped her understanding of herself and the world around her. She had seen firsthand how quickly life could transform, how perception could influence reality, how fragile normalcy could be. In the quiet moments that followed, she existed in a strange space between past and future. She was no longer the woman she had been before April 1924, but she was also not fully free from the shadow of that moment. Her story had entered history, whether she wanted it to or not. The world, however, continued moving. Chicago's streets remained loud and restless. Jazz still played in hidden clubs. The city's energy did not pause for individual stories. Yet somewhere within that endless motion lived the memory of a woman who had stood at the center of one of its most unforgettable trials. Beulah Annan walked forward into her future carrying something invisible but permanent. The knowledge that her life had become part of a larger story, one that would continue to be remembered, debated, and reinterpreted long after the courtroom had emptied and the headlines had faded.